Hello. Hi, my name's Grania and I'm here to talk to you about the challenges that I faced breastfeeding my baby who was born with some additional health needs. So Tessa, my third baby, was born in 2003 with an extremely rare condition called BAM syndrome, Bosma Aerina microbophthalmia syndrome. Basically, Tessa was born without a nose. We were expecting a perfectly healthy baby, and it was a huge shock and absolutely terrifying when she was born. We were separated almost immediately, and she was taken to NICU with clear instruction that only human milk be given until my milk came in. The separation was excruciating. I spent that first night empty and alone and crying until I fell asleep. I was in shock, heartbroken and grieving, and it was overwhelming. I felt grief for the baby in the future that I thought I was getting, and guilt for having those feelings. Then came the devastating realization that I wouldn't be able to feed my baby. I was already training to be a breastfeeding counsellor with the La Leche League, and I was still nursing my 2-year-old, so I absolutely planned to breastfeed. But this now looked completely impossible. I knew you needed 2 airways to breastfeed, and the pain of thinking that I'd never feed her myself was unbearable. NICU was heartbreaking and incredibly stressful. Far from maternal contact or kangaroo care being encouraged, it was actively discouraged. I'll never forget the words "minimal handling recommended" written on her notes. Their belief that moving or holding my newborn daughter would cause her to bring up even more milk than she already was in total contrast to my own belief that not being held by her mother was inherently stressful to my baby, and that perhaps lying in a box with 2 tubes down her throat, being fed large amounts of milk 3-hourly, had something to do with her not tolerating her feeds, as they put it. Everything about NICU was stressful and upsetting. The expectation was that I would go home once discharged and make the trip every few days to drop off some pumped milk and let the staff do their jobs. This was absolutely not going to happen, and I refused to leave the hospital when my baby was there. I cried and begged whoever would listen until I was begrudgingly allowed to sleep in one of the 3 family rooms. But I was told that if it was needed by the parents of a critically ill baby, that they would be prioritised. I agreed, of course, and just in case, I never once even peeled back the bed covers in the 5 weeks that I stayed in those rooms. Every night I would just lie on top of the covers with a large cardigan over me so that I wouldn't be a bother. And every day I would start again with a new ward sister and beg to stay the night, never knowing from one day to the next if I was going to be allowed. When Tessa was 8 days old, she was transferred to the Children's Hospital to have a tracheostomy placed as a second airway. This had given me hope that breastfeeding might actually be possible, and I googled breastfeeding and tracheostomies over and over and read everything I could. After the op, Tessa was cared for in pediatric ICU for a week. In stark contrast to the NICU setup, I was handed my baby straight away, and I was free to hold her for as long and whenever I liked, which was all the time. No one ever asked me to go home. 2 days later, when Tessa was 10 days old, and 2 days after her trachea operation, I was allowed to try her at the breast. It was terrifying and awkward, and I kept thinking I was going to hurt her because of her trachea, but she latched, and we had our first feed, and it felt incredible. We had a few successful feeds before being transferred back to NICU, despite me begging to be allowed to remain in PICU. I couldn't understand why anyone thought it was necessary. Tess was on room air, she was stable, she wasn't ill, she wasn't trachea dependent or on oxygen, but hospital policy meant that she was going back to NICU whether I liked it or not, and it would be a further 3 weeks before we got home. They actually put Tessa back into an incubator, and I had to practically cause a scene to get her out. They finally agreed and wheeled an open cot in. Instead of deciding to make an exception to policy and let Tessa go to special care, they put a cot in NICU, and for 3 weeks we took up an expensive, life-saving spot with a medically healthy baby with nothing but an arbitrary oxygen monitor on her toe. Tess was being tube fed, and trying to get breastfeeding established was impossible in NICU. First, I wasn't allowed to try without being assessed by speech and language, even though we'd already tried in PICU and had successful feeds. The speech and language therapist only worked 2 days a week, and Tessa slept and couldn't be woken up the first day she came, so a week went by. I wasn't allowed to remove the feeding tube, which was taped to her mouth to help her latch, and I only had a hard upright chair in which to try and feed in, and I was never given adequate time. Tessa was still bringing up large amounts of milk, and her weight gain was low. having discovered to my absolute horror that fortifier had been added to her feeds without my knowledge or consent in the first week. I had repeated loudly that nothing but my milk be given. Her consultants wanted to add thickener to stop her bringing up her feeds. I refused, instead asking for 2 hourly feeds with less volume and to be allowed to feed her upright on my knee. One consultant, who spoke so condescendingly to me, explaining why they wanted to add thickener, was so put out that I refused, that she wrote, "Tessa's feeding is what's keeping her in hospital," in her notes. At this point, neither me or her father had had any trachea training at all, so nothing could have been further from the truth. I decided to focus then on getting her weight up, so I kept asking until someone finally said yes to 2 hourly tube feeds and upright feeding. And it worked. She stopped throwing up so much, her weight gain increased, but they wouldn't discharge her on 2 hourly feeds, even when I told them that my other newborns would have fed at least that often. They just suggested a pump feed for overnight, and again, I refused that. I was told that 2 hourly feeds aren't sustainable, no matter how good a mother you are. Breastfeeding was absolutely not a priority in NICU. Breast milk and pumping were definitely advocated, but when it came to actually getting a baby to the breast, it was a very different story, and I never felt it was valued as something that anyone should be spending any time or effort on. Now, some of the staff were exceptional, and 1 or 2 went above and beyond for me and my baby, and I am forever grateful. Others, however, took a different stance. I was made to feel like I was an inconvenience. I was told that my inability to leave was an indication that I wasn't coping. I was told to think of my other children. I was constantly asked to leave. I was told that Tessa didn't know I was there. I was lied to about the availability of accommodation. I was told she needed fortifier, high-calorie formula, and thickener. I was made to feel stupid and obstinate for refusing these things. I had no one looking after me. I watched as babies were left to cry, or left to settle, as the staff called it. And I had nightmares that Tessa was crying when I wasn't there with her. Now, I was lucky enough to have a leche leader and a dear friend at the other end of the phone. I would cry regularly about my frustrations at not being given any chance to get Tessa to breastfeed, and she would reassure me that there was still time and that she'd be there when I got home. I only lasted 5 days at home with the tube feeds. One night, Tessa threw up her tube and I didn't replace it. I swore we were going to get breastfeeding no matter what anyone thought, and I knew that she could do it. Eventually she latched that night, and I cried, and we made it through the weekend. On Monday she hadn't lost any weight, and I was ecstatic. We found that she could take a bottle easier, as a few of her reflexes weren't kicking in. Firstly, she had no hunger cues because she'd been on scheduled feeds for so long, and secondly, she wouldn't latch or swallow until she felt pressure on her palate. I could get the bottle teat into her mouth without her cooperation, but not my nipple. So, with my friend and allegedly leader Carol Smith's help, we began to transition from bottle to breast. This cost many tears, and I felt like I needed 3 extra hands most of the time, but a combination of motion, so I'd walk and bounce, sometimes using a sling, a switch and bait technique where I'd start her suckling on the bottle or dummy in the crook of my arm, and then quickly and as smoothly as possible swap her, and using an exaggerated latch technique to try and get as deep a latch as possible, we started to have some success. It was a huge learning curve and extremely emotionally difficult, as it feels like repeated rejections when your baby is crying for a bottle and not you. Carol suggested that Tessa's lack of smell could be playing a part in preventing her reflexes from working in the usual sequence. Tessa would root and root, but seemed completely incapable of knowing when or how to latch. But amazingly, by 8 weeks old, Tessa was exclusively breastfed. She stayed on the last centile line, which seemed to stress her dietitian out, but she gained and grew steadily on that line and is still there 6 years later. She nursed with her older sister for 2 years and shared with her little brother for 2 years, only stopping a few months before her 6th birthday. And that's the story of how I managed to feed my baby.